Today we have attorney Rod Kight on the show. Attorney Kight has 20 years of business development experience, with 5 of those specialized in cannabis. Mr. Kight, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. I'm really glad to be here.
I wanted to also mention that you wrote a fantastic book on cannabis business law, What You Need to Know. So this show will really delve into a lot of what people need to know, particularly in the hemp space. Wanted to see how you got your start within the cannabis market. How did you get interested?
Yeah, sure. So I got interested. I've always thought that cannabis should be legal, and I've used it off and on throughout my life since college. But I got my start professionally because I got testicular cancer diagnosed about 10 years ago. And so I had to go through chemotherapy treatments. And I had decided that even though I had heard that cannabis could help, I didn't want to do that. I thought in my mind that it would just be a sort of a cheap reason to get high, to use my illness to get high. And so for about the first half of my treatment, I didn't use cannabis. But one day I was feeling particularly bad, and my brother was in town visiting, just kind of helping me. And he was smoked some cannabis in the next room, and I finally thought, well, I don't have anything to lose. And so I got out of bed and went and I smoked a little bit, not really expecting anything. And the results were really stunning and fairly immediate. That I had gained an appetite. My muscle aches that often arise from chemotherapy and nausea had subsided significantly. I was able to get a good night's rest, and I realized that cannabis actually impacted me physically in a way that was very healing and helped me to get through chemotherapy. And it was that point I realized, it was like a bell went off in my head. This really is medicine. I had thought that maybe the medical marijuana movement was more of a Trojan horse for full legalization. And while I believed in full legalization, it never occurred to me that there was some real need for it medically. And so I decided at that time I needed to shift my career to be focused on this industry. And it took, a little bit of time to shift my law practice over from, business law generally and bankruptcy and some other things I was doing to the cannabis industry. In particular, as an attorney who was, I live in North Carolina, which is a prohibition state, at least for marijuana, happens to be a very big hemp state, and how to, figure out how to represent businesses in the cannabis industry from North Carolina. And fortunately, that was around the same time that the 2014 Farm Bill came into effect, which legalized hemp in certain circumstances. It was the beginning of the CBD boom, and so consequently, we represent a lot of companies in the hemp and the CBD business because of that.
Interesting. So are the opinions and attitudes still against marijuana within the South, or particularly North Carolina?
You talking about the opinions of sort of citizens in North Carolina
Right,
about
the
marijuana?
general opinion.
Yeah, North Carolina is one of those what they call battleground states when you're looking at national elections and whatnot. And I think that from an actual population standpoint, we are kind of right in the middle. There's about a number, as a number of Democrats as Republicans in the state. Although our state legislature has a supermajority of Republicans, we're also known for being one of the most gerrymandered states in the country.
Right.
But when you come down to actual opinions about cannabis and marijuana in particular, I don't have the most up-to-date statistics, but we do have a majority of our citizens that want marijuana to be legal, certainly at the medical level. And then, when we talk about cannabis, and if I could take sort of a short little aside, cannabis is a botanical term. It's not a legal term of art. And so cannabis is the entire plant. And so there are two forms of cannabis when it comes to the law. There's marijuana, which is an illegal form of cannabis, at least at the federal level and in several states. And that's just cannabis that has more than 0.3% delta-9 THC. And on the other side, you have hemp, which is a form of cannabis that has no more than 0.3% delta-9 THC and is grown pursuant to a state hemp law. But it's the same plant. And so North Carolina actually happens to be one of the top states when it comes to hemp production, and attitudes towards hemp in North Carolina are way in the 90% plus, I believe, acceptable range for citizens. So when we make that distinction, North Carolina on the marijuana side, there is a majority of the citizens that want it. We don't have, unfortunately, our legislature's not in a place to enact those laws yet. They're a little more conservative than the general population. But when it comes to hemp, we have a very robust hemp laws, and attitudes towards hemp are very positive.
Fantastic. Does North Carolina do a lot of export when it comes to hemp and hemp products?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question.
Is there a lot of export from North Carolina in hemp and hemp products? Is it a major agricultural state?
Oh, yes, sure. So North Carolina does have quite a bit of export of its products throughout the country and to some degree to the world. North Carolina, as you may be aware, is part of one of the the southern grouping of states that had a lot of tobacco industry, and the tobacco industry has changed dramatically over the years. And there's a lot of farmers who were in generations worth of tobacco farming, a lot of processors who did generations worth of processing that don't have that same source of income, and a lot of them are pivoting towards hemp. And so we do have quite a number of farmers. We do have several processors and manufacturers, and their products are being exported throughout the country.
And is most of the hemp being grown for CBD or is it for fiber or other uses?
Yeah, good question. So most of the hemp is being grown for CBD and cannabinoids. We do have, a lot of the land and ability to grow for fiber, but I think that's still a developing market in North Carolina and the Southeast in general.
Got it. And I hear that there's always a possibility that when you grow hemp, the plant can produce more than 0.03% THC. What happens when I guess a farmer is faced with that issue?
I'll tell you, this is a great question. So you're exactly right. In order for hemp to be legal, then it has to have no more than 0.3% delta 9 THC. And that raises a lot of issues. The question you asked is what happens to it depends on the state in which you're operating. In most states, you have a couple of bites of the apple. In other words, you can ask for a retest once or twice, but if the tests all come back hot, as they say, which means it's just the concentrations of THC are in excess of 0.3%, well, then they require crops to be destroyed. And
Wow.
it's no exaggeration to say that farmers literally cry. I mean, you can imagine you've devoted an entire season, you've got an investment of time and money and resources, you're anticipating this being a good income, and then there it is in front of you being destroyed. So it's pretty onerous, and it continues to be risky for farmers.
Can they pivot that plant and use it for other usage like fiber, etc., or is that not even a possibility?
That is what should be done. Well, what should be done is we should have different laws altogether, but
Right.
that's a whole different conversation.
Right.
That should be done. Unfortunately, in most states, the entire plant has to be destroyed, because what happens is the plant itself is either defined by statute as legal or illegal, and so the idea of dividing it into legal and illegal parts is typically not acceptable. That being said, I can't recall off the top of my head what states allow that. I believe there are some that do allow the stalks to be preserved. And in fact, the legal definition of marijuana under federal law exempts or excludes from the definition of marijuana the mature stalks. And so there is certainly a compelling argument in some state laws that will allow those stalks to be preserved for fiber purposes.
Wow. So eye-opening. Now, is there a continual testing process that goes on as the hemp plant matures to make sure that it doesn't test hot? So do farmers say, okay, it's ready to harvest, we're going to start testing from this point on?
Right. Well, that's typically the strategy is to get the plant tested as soon as it begins to flower, because and I'm sure your listeners are aware, the cannabinoids develop and evolve over time. And so the longer, again, generally speaking, the plant's in the ground, the more the cannabinoids develop and the more the THC concentrations in particular develop. So farmers will see if, their plants begin to flower, they'll try to get it tested, and hopefully those results will come back in a way that's, I don't want to say positive or negative. So they'll come back such that the plant is deemed to be compliant, is the best way to say that. And then they can
Wow.
go ahead and harvest. But, a lot of things, there's a lot of failure points in that process. A farmer may say, okay, I want to get testing. But if the state comes out and actually sends people to take the samples and do the testing, states by and large don't have the resources to do it very quickly. And so it may take weeks before the people come out there and can actually take the samples, during which time the cannabinoids continue to develop and evolve. And another issue that we're seeing, and there are a lot of these issues about testing. Another issue is that, well, let's say your plant does come back. Your test samples do come back and it's compliant hemp, and then it takes you another couple of weeks to get your hemp plant harvested. Again, during that time, the THC concentrations continue to develop and evolve, but you've already been approved. And so but your harvested crop might test hot, whereas your pre-harvest crop did not, and you've got a state sort of approval. What happens to this post-harvest hemp that's hot? And these are all questions that unfortunately don't have a lot of good answers.
So if that happens, they need to find an attorney like yourself and figure out what the solutions are. Is that correct?
Yeah, I always, I don't want to make plugs for attorneys, but unfortunately, this is one of those industries where it really does help to have an attorney to help navigate these issues, because they're subtle and they can really mean the difference sometimes between losing a crop and staying on the right side of the law.
Interesting. Now, I think on the marijuana side, typically they want plant uniformity, and typically farmers are growing from clones. How about in hemp? Is it a seed or clone-based agricultural process?
It's a little bit of both, actually. There's some big seed companies that sell different genetic varieties, but there is a substantial, market in clones for the very reason that you say. You want that uniformity. And in particular for growing for CBD, growing for smokable flower, it's very much like in the marijuana side, where you do need that uniformity. You need to know that we can grow all these plots. They're going to pop out about the same, terpene and cannabinoid profiles. And they're going to appear a certain way, and they're going to grow right in a certain climate. So, I think we have a pretty strong clone business in hemp.
And is there like specific names in hemp that you should look for if you're looking at high CBD concentrations for smoking, for example?
Yeah. So when you're looking for smokable hemp, and we can talk about that, which is, I think, probably for some listeners in marijuana-friendly states, this might be a bizarre notion to smoke hemp, which I can talk about. But to answer the question, when you're looking for hemp, I think that high CBD concentrations, it's sort of the analog to high THC concentrations in the marijuana market, right? So if you're in Colorado or Oregon or California, you typically the consumer wants, as much THC as possible. That's what I've gathered. Whereas in the hemp states, people want the highest CBD concentrations as possible. That being said, there's some other factors to consider. One is the terpenes. Does your hemp smell like hay, which people don't really want, or does it smell really nice and skunky like cannabis should smell? And also, does it have other cannabinoids? One of the things that I really like about the hemp industry is because you've effectively taken THC out of the picture, the plants are grown to for their other cannabinoids. And so you have CBG rich strains were the big deal this year, and we're probably going to be even more of a big deal next year. And so you have plants that are specifically grown to display or present for these other cannabinoids. And so you want to look at that. And then finally, you want to look at things just that you'd always want to look for: mold and mildew and heavy metals and all sorts of other adulterants. You don't want those to be in your plant. And a good producer will, A, not sell products that contain those things, and B, have certificates of analysis, what we call COAs, that demonstrate that the products are, in fact, within the acceptable ranges for all of these different compounds.
Is there the same regulation that applies to marijuana being applied to hemp in terms of the purity of the product?
It's getting there. One of the things that it took a while for the marijuana industry to really get its head around, but it's done a good job and is ahead of the hemp industry on, is the standards. And particularly Colorado has taken a big lead in making sure that marijuana products, whether they be raw flower or tinctures or vapes or whatnot, are produced under circumstances where these adulterants are not in the products. The hemp industry is getting there, and I think it's going to be there soon, but it's not quite as regulated on that front as the marijuana industry.
So I've been seeing, you can buy hemp cigarettes now on Amazon. Is there anything in particular that people should look for in terms of purchasing for, I guess, personal use? And is it even a health product? Is it a good idea to smoke a high CBD hemp cigarette?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So in terms of what to look for, the first thing is that the company these are actually legal. And that is a more difficult question than it first appears. The first thing is that the hemp that's being used in the cigarettes was produced by a lawful hemp grower. And any reputable seller of pre-rolls or hemp flower or hemp cigarettes should be able to provide, if asked, copies of certificates of analysis, what we just talked about, showing that the THC levels are within the compliant range. Also showing how much CBD you're getting, and that it's not contaminated. Should also be able to show you the registered farmers or the farmer's registration, or at least be able to confirm that this is from a registered farm. And so those are the things that I would look for. When it comes to the legal status of smokable hemp, that's a little bit different. At the federal level, it's totally lawful. And under the laws of most states, it is lawful. However, there are a handful of states that either do not have hemp laws at all. And so the position they take is that hemp is not legal at all in their states. And that's probably an incorrect position with respect to federal law, but it's something that hasn't really been tested or the parameters haven't been set by courts yet, because this is a new issue. Other states expressly ban and prohibit smokable hemp. And in fact, Indiana recently enacted a law that made the possession and use of smokable hemp without a license a crime. And there was a federal lawsuit that was filed just about 2 months ago, and that lawsuit is still pending, but the federal court entered an injunction that prohibited Indiana from enforcing this ban. It said, no, this is what we call preempted by federal law. Federal law controls in this area, and federal law says that hemp is legal. And I'm intentionally being kind of general about these. There's some very technical legal arguments and things going on, but the main point is that federal law is prohibiting at least Indiana from enforcing a smokable hemp ban, and there are going to be some other lawsuits in other states that are trying to prohibit it. So as a consumer, that adds a big burden, but you certainly want to feel comfortable that you're in a state that allows it, because even if your state is wrong, that doesn't necessarily stop the state from trying to enforce it or charge you with a crime in the meantime, which can be a real pain. The second thing you were asking me about is, should people smoke it for health? And so I'm no doctor, and I don't want to opine on that. I think any doctor is probably going to say that combusting something and then inhaling that smoke into your lungs is not necessarily a good thing. That being said, one of the things that people like about smokable hemp is that they can titrate pretty regularly. And titration is just a word meaning that you can kind of adjust in real time how much of the medication you're getting. And so if you're smoking a high CBD hemp cigarette in order to ease your anxiety, you can tell pretty much how much you need. Do you need to smoke the whole thing? Do you feel good after half of it? So on and so forth. Whereas if you're using a hemp-based CBD tincture, you're taking a drop under your tongue, and it might be an hour or two before you start to feel the effects. And they're often very subtle, because CBD does not have a psychoactive effect. So you're trying to determine, well, do I feel more relaxed, less anxious or whatnot? And it's just harder to titrate. So I do think that there is a benefit to smoking, at least in that respect.
Okay, good to know. But it's probably not the best way to get CBD into your system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that most doctors would say there are other ways that besides smoking it. And I'm someone that smokes, hemp and marijuana, and I mean, I'm a big fan of cannabis. But that's, again, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a doctor, so I would be surprised if there were a lot of doctors that were saying, yes, you should actually be smoking this, even if they believed you should be getting the cannabinoids in some way, shape, or form for your health.
Got it. Very interesting topic. Now, I know there's a lot of issues with taxation within marijuana versus hemp. How does the law apply, and how does the law distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Taxes are, while some people think a super boring subject, and I'll try not to make it boring, they're actually really it's a really big issue for the cannabis industry in general. So the gist of it is there's an IRS law, or IRS code 280E. And what 280E says is that a company that is in the business of trafficking illegal drugs cannot deduct the normal costs of doing business from their income for tax purposes. And so, for example, a company that's involved in cultivating a marijuana grow, or a dispensary dispensing marijuana products, while a normal cultivation of some other agricultural product, or a normal dispensary of some other non-marijuana products, could deduct things like rent and wages and advertising and so on and so forth from their income, and only pay taxes on the net profit. That is not the case with companies engaged in the marijuana trade. And the reason is because marijuana is federally illegal. And so it is trafficking a drug. And there are a lot of subtleties about because you can deduct the cost of goods as to what constitutes the cost of goods. And I definitely don't want to bore the readers your listeners with delving into those distinctions. But at a big scale, this is a huge issue for marijuana companies, because using the same numbers, a lot of companies would be wildly profitable. But because of the onerous tax burden imposed by 280E, they actually are not very profitable, and sometimes even go into the red just based on this tax burden that they have. And then the corollary to that, the other piece of your question is, how does that apply to the hemp world? Fortunately, it does not apply to the hemp world, and that's because hemp is federally lawful. And so if you're engaged in the hemp industry, 280E does not apply. And just as a little sort of anecdote, and I'm sorry, you ask a lawyer a question and we'll just talk. So I apologize. But as a little anecdote as to why we have this weird law, it happened because back in the 80s, there was a notorious drug bust of a cocaine dealer. Mm-hmm. And that cocaine dealer had not filed taxes for several years, as a lot of drug dealers are, they're not typically known for filing their taxes. But this guy got busted, and one of the sanctions that he was facing was having to pay an enormous amount of tax. The IRS said, well, you sold all this cocaine and we're going to tax you based on it. And his lawyers and accountants got the bright idea that they would go ahead and file tax returns and deduct all sorts of normal business expenses, wow, including scales and all that. And there was no law to prevent this. And so when he filed his taxes, this notorious cocaine dealer was allowed to deduct all these business expenses from his cocaine empire, and that enraged Congress. And it was the just say no Nancy Reagan years. And so Congress enacted this law that says, businesses cannot deduct, expenses when they're trafficking illegal drugs. And that law makes some sense in that context. But now we have businesses that are absolutely legal under state law. They're compliant as you can possibly be, but because they're dealing in a substance that's federally illegal, it triggers this tax provision.
How do you think safe banking is going to affect 280E? How's the market going to change if we have safe banking?
If we have safe banking, is that what?
Yes, correct.
Yes. So banking is a related issue, and again, because banks tend to be involved in the Federal Reserve System, they tend to be interstate, national types of companies. Banks are very, very nervous about getting involved with marijuana businesses, again, because they do not want to be what amounts to conspiring to sell illegal, federally illegal substances. They don't want to be perceived as money launderers for illegal substances. And so while banks can bank marijuana companies under certain circumstances, they tend not to. And so the Safe Banking Act would go a long way towards allowing marijuana businesses to actually engage the banking section, which, if you think about running a business without a bank account, it's something that's very simple, but that can kill a business, just the ability not to engage in banking.
Do you feel that... Sorry. Do you feel that...
I was just going to say, it sounds like we got somebody backing up near you over there with the backup.
You can hear all that. Yes, this is Hollywood, so there's a lot of ambient noise, as we call it, unfortunately.
I bet.
Darn it.
Good city noise, I hear it.
A lot of city noise, for sure. So do you feel that safe banking is going to affect 280E?
Well, they're two different issues, and I think that's a good question. What needs to happen is, the thing that needs to happen is that marijuana needs to be removed from the controlled substances list. That would fix all the problems. But short of that grand thing that we think needs to happen, 280E needs to be either repealed outright or amended to exclude businesses that are compliant with their state's laws. That's one thing that needs to happen. And then with the Safe Banking Act, that needs to happen so that these marijuana businesses can interact with the financial system in a normal way. Right. And you think it really is to everyone's benefit. It's not only to, if we're looking from a regulator standpoint, who don't necessarily care so much about the viability of certain businesses, but it helps a lot of things that regulators are concerned with. What about tracking and tracing money? If businesses are forced to deal solely in cash, it's really difficult to pin down in a lot of circumstances how much cash they're running through. Whereas if a business just normally makes deposits and pays expenses through a bank account, that's really easy. They can just use bank records. Another thing is just safety. If a company's dealing in hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash every week or month or whatever, and having to store that, well, there's an enormous security issue that, again, can be resolved just by being able to bank in a normal way. So I think the Safe Banking Act and 280E, while different subjects, together, the combination of them are just going to help further bring marijuana businesses into the fold if we can get them, the Safe Banking Act enacted and 280E modified in some way.
Do you feel like that's going to pave the way for consolidation and big business to enter the market?
I think so. Every little incremental step like this further helps to open up the industry and to normalize it. But businesses in the marijuana space, by and large, have to be very state specific because they get licensed in, California or Nevada or Colorado and have to comply with those laws. They can't ship their products across state lines because that's a federal crime. And so if they're going to, spread to another state, then it's a much more complicated legal structure that they have to do in order to do that versus if the product was federally legal. So yeah, every step that makes it a little more easier enables more businesses to engage with the industry in a way that's more normal and that makes it more profitable, which brings more people and further normalizes it and so on and so forth.
But do you feel like it will be harder for the little guy to enter the market at that point?
Well, I think yes and no. So like any industry in the present, political and economic situation, that's a broad term, but I think that we have an economic system that tends, frankly, to favor big conglomerates over smaller players. There's whether it's from a tax advantage, whether it's from just a resources standpoint, or whether it's just more efficient to run a big, operation than a lot of smaller ones. We do tend to favor consolidation, particularly in the U.S. And so I think as the industry becomes more and more mature and we see more and more of the big mergers and big players entering the space, I think there's going to be a certain amount of an attrition rate that happens with smaller players. They're just not going to be able to keep up. That being said, the marijuana and the hemp industry has gotten a substantial start at the ground level. And there's a lot of respect and a lot of action that's happened on the ground level with these small players. And to a certain degree, the laws and regulations reflect that. And most importantly, I think that a lot of consumers really connect to that as well. So I think there will always be a place for the more artisanal, small, nimble, well-run companies, even in light of the fact that we're going to see a lot of big, corporate companies entering the space before too long.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about CBD. CBD and hemp really do go hand in hand, but I think last I went to a CBD conference, there were over 5,000 different brands and products that were being represented. How do you think legalization will affect that space? Will it affect that space? And what are we looking forward to in the CBD space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So CBD is its own whole topic. And what we tend to deal with in my office is hemp-derived CBD. And the reason is marijuana-derived CBD is a marijuana product. And so it tends to be very specific to its state. So, a marijuana-derived CBD product in Oregon, you're only going to find in Oregon licensed dispensaries. Mm-hmm. Whereas, a hemp-derived CBD product can be shipped and consumed throughout the United States and in other parts of the world. That's because hemp is lawful. And the legal status of hemp depends on the plant from which it's derived, just by the way the laws are written. Something CBD derived from marijuana, while it's the same compound as CBD derived from hemp, is illegal because compounds derived from marijuana are illegal, whereas compounds derived from hemp are legal. So, but as far as the market itself and how it's developing, I think that the legalization of marijuana, I don't see that's going to have a substantial impact on the CBD industry, which is already enormous. Like you said, you saw thousands of products out there. Hemp is legal. It's grown in most states in the United States. There's a lot of material to produce it. And it's also legal to access in most states, and so people have wide access to it. So I don't see that legalizing marijuana is going to necessarily impact that too much.
What about those people that say that CBD on its own is not effective, that it needs to be consumed with THC or other cannabinoids in order to potentiate it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so absolutely, there is a synergistic effect that a lot of people experience with multiple cannabinoids, including, and I think most notably, THC. And so, a hemp-derived CBD product can contain up to 0.3% THC. And still remain legal, and so for a lot of people, they call that full spectrum in the market. For a lot of people, full spectrum products are helpful, but for some people that need more THC, and that's an unfortunate state of the law right now, is that if you live in a place where marijuana is legal, well, then you can get the access to the THC that you need. Whereas if you live in a state where it's not legal, you can't, and you're just kind of stuck with the 0.3% or less, and might have to take more in order to get the effects you're looking for.
Got it. So it's individual in application, and you have to see what works for you.
Right, I think so, absolutely. And we're experiencing a lot of situations where consumers don't know what they're getting, and there are a lot of companies that are unfortunately, marketing their products as having X amount of CBD, maybe 1,000 milligrams per tincture or whatever, and it turns out that they don't have anywhere near that, and so consumers don't necessarily know what they're getting, and so they think, oh well, this tincture is not working, but it says 1,000, so I must need 2,000 or 5,000 or whatever. When actually they're not getting what they're thinking they're getting because of labeling. And this is a regulatory issue, and this is part of the hemp industry's evolution, is to to operate more like a normal industry where there are regulations. And if you say you have X amount of an ingredient in a product, that's how much ingredients in the product. That's just how and so there's some class action lawsuits about this. There's some regulations that we can expect that are coming from state to state.
Right now, are hemp or CBD products using good manufacturing practices? Is that a requirement?
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of companies are moving in that direction. The deal is that there are, as of right now at least, there are not good manufacturing practices established for hemp yet. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the FDA contends that CBD may not be used as a food ingredient, nor may it be marketed as a dietary supplement. And so by definition, if that's the case, then there aren't good manufacturing practices to cover it. So what you're seeing is a lot of companies are going in and they're implementing good manufacturing practices for CBD products as if they were dietary supplements or a food, so that if and when the FDA gives its blessing, they are compliant with those protocols.
Got it. Now, at this point, how much CBD do you think is imported from China? I know there was a point that we were importing a lot of our CBD from China or outside the country.
I think it's difficult to tell. I think it's less and less. But the reason it's difficult to tell is because there's also a lot of European CBD that at least historically has been imported into the United States. And a lot of that European CBD is actually Chinese CBD masquerading as European CBD. In other words, the European producer or broker will buy it from China, sort of rebrand it, and then resell it to the United States. So that's a good question. I don't know how much Chinese CBD we're getting. I think that as production costs for hemp and processing of hemp into CBD continues to drop, and we get more and more product on the market, just the laws of supply and demand, the prices are going to continue to drop, so that there's not as much of a need to import it. We can source it domestically. So, for example, at the beginning of the year, I have a lot of clients who are brokers in the CBD and hemp industry, and they're constantly buying and selling in bulk these products. And I remember they were telling me that a kilo of CBD, say at the beginning of the year, was in $6,500 to $7,500.
I
And
remember
then by
that.
spring, that was down to about $4,000, and now you're under $3,000 a kilo. So the prices have more than have come down by half just in the last 6 to 8 months. So I think we're going to continue to see that cycle happen, and we're in CBD itself is going to end up being a very inexpensive commodity.
Interesting. Is there any way from a analysis perspective to identify synthetic CBD from phyto-derived CBD?
That's a great question, and I don't think I'm the right person to answer it. I think that on some level the answer is yes, and that may depend on how well the CBD is synthesized. What I would say to people who are concerned about that, and I think everyone should be concerned about it, is when you're looking for a product, whether you're a consumer who's buying a product or whether you are a business that's buying it in bulk to resell or use in some way, is you want to look at the paper trail. You want the person that's selling it to you, the company that's selling it to you, to be able to show, here's the registrations of the farmers that grew the hemp. Here are the processing registrations of the product that was processed from that hemp, and we call it the chain of title, from the seed or the clone all the way to the sale. And that really is the only way. And certainly if someone is trying to outright scam you, sometimes it's difficult, if not impossible, to penetrate that. But short of someone just out and out trying to scam you, if you do your due diligence, you can usually rest reasonably assured that what you're consuming or using is phyto-based CBD.
So at this point, consumers need to do their due diligence and be very careful with which product they consume.
I think so, yeah. And it's unusual. Like if I'm going to get melatonin, for instance, I'll swing into the local grocery store. I'll look at the pricing and the branding, and I'll grab a bottle of melatonin, and I'm off my way. It really doesn't occur to me to do due diligence on the melatonin.
Right.
But unfortunately, when it comes to CBD, that's just where we are in the market. And there's you don't have to do your due diligence on every single time you go buy it, but maybe on a few of the brands, and contact that brand, reach out to them and say, I'm doing my due diligence. Can you tell me more about your product? Can you tell me where it comes from and provide some documentation? And most reputable brands will be happy to work with the consumer on that. And 5 years from now, I think we're going to be in a different spot. We're going to be able to see, we're going to know exactly the circumstances under which CBD is legal and where it's allowed, certainly, but we're also going to feel comfortable that when you can walk in the grocery store, say, oh yeah, I can count on this being the real deal, buy it and not think about it. But for right now, people who are taking it need to be, dig in a little bit more than they normally would.
What are your thoughts on pharmaceutical grade CBD products like Epidiolex?
Right. So I think there's, I'm of the belief that there's a spot for everything. Pharmaceutical companies are very good and have the resources typically to conduct research and development at a very high level for specific indications, meaning, different types of disease states where compounds like CBD can be helpful. And when those indications are, or when the compound is shown to help in with those indications, and pharmaceutical companies are going to put products out there, they need what we call pharma grade compounds. They can't just have some less than pure substance to use because this is high end medical type stuff. And so I think that Epidiolex is a medication that was developed using all the right clinical trials and processes, and it's indicated for very specific forms of seizure. And I think that that's what we have our pharmaceutical and FDA test trials for. That being said, we have a very robust natural products industry in the United States and frankly throughout much of the world that's very helpful to people, and it's not quite as rigorous and for a lot of different reasons. And I absolutely want to preserve the natural products industry as cannabis and cannabinoids from cannabis continues to penetrate the market and more people are interested in it. I definitely don't think that it should be the sole purview of the pharmaceutical companies. And then finally, there are a lot of people that really feel, myself included, a real affinity for the plant itself. And people, I think, should always be able to grow cannabis that they want to consume personally. I think it's a crop and it's an agricultural commodity, and that should be preserved as well. So I see a multi-tiered system evolving in the world, and I certainly hope that that's how it continues to evolve.
Now, the FDA recently scheduled CBD as a Schedule 5, and some people fear that that is opening the path for the pharmaceutical industry to take over the CBD market. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great question. So when someone asks me, is CBD legal? The first thing I say is, well, it depends on what you mean by that. And so, the first thing is it a controlled substance or not? Meaning, controlled substances are the federal list of substances that are regulated on some level. Schedule 1 being the most strict, and that's what marijuana currently is. And so, when you ask about CBD, CBD is either Schedule 1, Schedule 5, or not scheduled at all, depending on what it is and what its source is. And by that, I mean CBD that's derived from marijuana is Schedule 1.
Mm-hmm.
CBD that's derived from marijuana that is the product Epidiolex is Schedule 5.
Mm-hmm.
CBD that's derived from hemp or some other non-cannabis plant, you can actually get CBD from hops and some other sources. But when it's derived from a legal plant, is not scheduled at all. And that causes certainly a lot of confusion in the industry and in the market at large. To your point about your question, rescheduling CBD and how does that going to open up a path specific for pharmaceutical products? I think it could. I believe that Joe Biden, one of the presidential contenders, believes that marijuana should be rescheduled, but maybe it's only to Schedule 2.
Right.
But what that does is that to me is really a pharmaceutical play, and I'm very much opposed to Biden's position on that, because what happens then is all of these compounds then are then essentially have to be plugged into this pharmaceutical system. And while I believe there's certainly a place for that, I absolutely do not believe that it's a place that should be exclusive. I think we should have a very big, robust market for the natural products that aren't scheduled and that aren't by prescription.
Can you tell the listeners what scheduling of 5 would mean to the consumer?
Well, Schedule 5 means that it's essentially, when it comes to a consumer situation, it means that it would have to be prescribed. And that might be fine for some people. Say, oh, well, my doctor will prescribe it for me. But it has to do with, how you get your, the cannabinoids that you want. Do you feel like you should have to go to a doctor? Now, maybe if you're having very specific medical condition, you have Crohn's disease or a seizure or something, PTSD, that a physician is going to say, well, this compound is going to work for you in these doses, and you want to be assured of purity. Well, maybe there's a pharmaceutical solution that makes sense. But for a lot of people that are taking it for general well-being, I think Schedule 5 would be a disaster, because they don't want to have to go to their doctor to get a prescription every time that they think that a cannabis product could help them.
Right. Interesting. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how the market evolves.
Yes, absolutely. And these are a big battleground that are being drawn. And I think we're going to see a lot of regulatory fights and tussles and battles and pronouncements and lawsuits over the next 5 to 10 years on all these issues.
Is there anything the consumer can do to make their voices known?
Absolutely. The first thing they can do is write to all of the legislators and Congress people who represent them and let them know how they feel. At the level, and this is at every level. If they live in the city of Los Angeles, the city of Phoenix, the city of Greenville, whatever it is, write to your county council people and city council and let them know. But certainly write to your statewide legislators. Certainly write to your Congress people and say, I want access to cannabis and cannabis products. That's, I think, the first thing. And the second is to support the industry and demand that the industry, regulate itself properly. Don't be buying, stuff off of Amazon that looks sketchy. Instead, do a little bit of research, find companies that you think are doing it the right way, and support those companies, and to the detriment, exclusive of these other companies, and tell your friends that these companies do it right. And that's just further supports people, creating the industry, self-regulating itself and protecting the consumer while growing the industry.
It definitely sounds like to produce quality product, it takes a large investment of time and money. So if you see a product that's too cheap to be true, then it probably is. So it's definitely something to kind of consider when you're being the consumer and buying those products at the
Yeah,
consumer
I think
end.
yeah, like the old adage, you sort of get what you pay for applies in every sector, including this one. And sometimes you can get captured by some fancy branding or clever advertising, but by and large, right, it does cost more, and it's more research intensive to make a quality product than to not make a quality product. And so I think that pricing and vetting is important.
Makes a lot of sense. What is your advice for people that might be interested in investing or getting involved with either hemp or the marijuana industry now?
Yeah, I think there's, wow, what I tell people about the industry is it's sort of like walking up to a buffet. There's so many good things to eat. There's so many opportunities, but you can't eat it all at once.
Right.
If you come back to your table with a plate that's piled on with everything in the buffet, it's just going to be a big slop. You're not going to be able to do it. And so I tell people the first thing to do is identify where their interest lies and where their gifts and talents are, because the cannabis industry at large, whether it be marijuana or hemp, is a full blown industry. It's like the auto industry or the the shoe industry, or the clothing industry maybe is better, or the it has all sorts of things. It's not just plant touching. A lot of times there are industries that impact cannabis that don't have anything to do with cannabis itself, whether it be a staffing agency or helping with legal issues, or helping with accounting issues, or maybe it's consulting with respect to agronomics, or developing novel ways of keeping pests away in the absence of rules regarding pesticides. Anyway, I'm just sort of kind of going off here. The bottom line is to first identify what you're good at and what your interests are, and then I think it's just a matter of learning about the plant and the industry itself. And a lot of that has to do, is just experiential. Get involved in some way and pay a whole lot of attention and ask a lot of questions.
What about those investors that want to small on the publicly traded market, or they want to invest in a friend or acquaintance that's getting into the business? What is your thoughts and suggestions as far as investment opportunities go?
Be careful is my first, and I'm not an investment advisor. And so just as a little legal disclaimer, anything I say is not to be used as investment advice. I'm in a weird spot because I'm someone who advocates very strongly for the cannabis industry at large, and I really want it to grow. By the same token, investing in this sector right now is still highly risky. And so if you're investing in a publicly traded company, there's some security in that, in the sense that you can watch the stock and how it's done historically. You can look at the books as they come out every quarter and see that. And I think there's some security in that. By the same token, I think a lot of the companies out there on the market are wildly overvalued, and I think we're likely to see a correction here in the next 6 to 18 months on that front. And so there's some money to be lost. By the same token, the industry as a whole is rapidly emerging, and so there's tons of money to be made. And I think the real money is made in investing in private companies. But investing in a private company requires a level of due diligence and knowledge that you don't necessarily do or have with respect to public companies. So if you're really going to make an investment, I would recommend doing all the vetting that you would normally do. Get a CPA, get a lawyer on board, look at a couple different opportunities, and then take those and sit down with a lawyer or accountant and say, I want to invest $100,000 or a million or 10,000 in this venture. Help me poke holes in it to figure out where where I could lose my money. And that could be anywhere from an inexperienced CEO to overambitious figures for harvest and what's going to be able to be sold. Or it could be any number of things, but I think you really have got to do your due diligence and examine the books and the operations.
Yeah, it looks like the talent pool in marijuana, or really the cannabis industry in general, is definitely a point to consider, right? Because a lot of people that have been in the industry are the typical original farmers that have been in this industry for some time. So they know the plant really well, but they don't know the nuances of growing big. Whereas a lot of entering CEOs may not know the industry really well, but have a lot of experience in the general market. So It's kind of an interesting transitional time from a talent perspective.
Okay, you hit the nail on the head. I think we've got a little bit of a culture clash, and I think in the big picture, it will resolve positively. Like as you said, we've got a lot of people that have been in the industry that know the plant, but don't know business, and vice versa. And the ability of those two to interact and share not and combine knowledge is powerful stuff. But it's also a rocky road sometimes to getting there. I've definitely had clients where we have both personalities or both levels of experience within the company, and it causes for some fireworks sometimes, as you might imagine.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and it's a great industry to be in from a, I guess, dynamic perspective. If you like evolution, this is the place to really witness it firsthand.
Oh yeah, it's not very often in a lifetime really that you get to see an industry emerge almost from nothing. And it's not that it emerged from nothing. There's always been a black market and then a gray market, but the cannabis industry is really sort of rising from the sea. And we're, to use a different metaphor, we're building the plane as we're flying it. It's happening all in real time, and it's fascinating and it's super exciting.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for all your time and all your insight. I really appreciate it. We'll make sure to put in the notes a key to your blog as well as your books. Do you have any last minute thoughts or comments?
Sure. I think for people who are listening are probably interested on some level in cannabis and CBD and marijuana and hemp and any or all of the above. And I would say to take that interest and pursue it, find out what you really like and read up on it, get involved, get engaged. It's a place where you have to be engaged both politically and in a business sense, and get ready for a wild ride.
Okay, that sounds very exciting. Well, Rod, thank you for all your time, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks, Tay. I appreciate it.